For 38 years, I counted other people's money. Stacks of 20s, rolls of dimes, a whole wheat harvest folded into a brown envelope. The church offering carried in on Monday mornings, still smelling of candle wax. In 38 years, I never once came up short at the end of a day. So let me tell you what it does to a woman to stand in the lobby of her own bank and hear her only daughter lean across the counter and say, soft as butter melting on a biscuit, "My mother just can't handle money anymore." Earl was 3 miles away when she said it. He was in a rented hospital bed in our dining room, where the good China used to live, too weak from the stroke to lift his own spoon. They were counting on him being too sick to ever find out. They were counting on me being too old and too tired to matter. But there was one thing my daughter and her husband forgot. Standing there with their notarized papers and their practiced sad faces, they forgot which side of that counter I had spent my whole life on. 6 weeks passed, quiet as snow, before they understood their mistake. This is the story of those 6 weeks. My name is Verna Holloway. I am 66 years old, and I live in Ponca City, Oklahoma, in a brick house on Overbrook Avenue, with a porch swing that has needed its chain oiled since the Carter administration. I married Earl when I was 19. He spent his life out at the refinery on the north edge of town, coming home with that sharp smell in his coveralls. And I spent mine downtown at First Cattleman's Bank, starting in a scratchy polyester vest in the spring of 1981, terrified of coming up a single penny off. I retired 4 years ago. By the end, they had me training every new hire who walked through the door. How to feel a counterfeit bill go slick and wrong under your thumb. How to spot an endorsement that had been traced instead of signed. How to tell, just from a man's hands at your window, that he was lying about whose check he was cashing. I spent 38 years learning to read people across 2 feet of countertop. My daughter forgot that. I never did. Keep that in your back pocket, because it matters more than everything else I'm about to tell you put together. And it is the only time I will point at it. Let me give you one picture of that old life, so you'll understand who they were really dealing with. There was a man, back in maybe 1994, who came to my window on a Friday with a tidy little stack of payroll checks, all smiles, all in a hurry. Everything about the paper was right, but his thumb kept worrying the corner of the top check, and he looked at my hands instead of my face, and he laughed 1 beat too long at his own joke. I cashed nothing. I called the company those checks were drawn on, and by Monday, there were 3 sheriff's deputies thanking me. I didn't catch him with a machine. I caught him because 30 years of standing in one place teaches you what a lie smells like. I tell you that now so you'll know it later. Let me tell you about my girl before I tell you what she did, because both things are true, and I am too old to pretend only one of them is. Renata was born in a January ice storm in 1979. Earl drove me to the hospital at 12 miles an hour with his hazards on, white-knuckled the whole way, talking to me the entire time so I wouldn't be scared. She came out hollering, and she has been the loudest, brightest thing in any room she has ever entered. I sewed her prom dress because we couldn't afford the one in the window at the dress shop, and she wore it like it was made of diamonds and told everyone her mother made it. When she was 9, she saved her allowance for 2 months, dimes and quarters in a peanut butter jar, and bought me a little glass bird for my birthday. I still have it on the kitchen sill. I looked at it a lot, those 6 weeks. So when I tell you what happened, I am not telling you a story about a monster. I wish I were. It is easier to hate a monster. I am telling you a story about a girl who saved her dimes for me, who somewhere along the way married a man who was drowning, and who decided that the easiest place to find dry land was to stand on her own mother. The man she married is named Kurt Pruitt. He owns a boat and motorhome dealership out on the highway toward Core Lake. All flags and banners, and a big inflatable man waving his arms in the wind. For a few good years, it did fine. Then the lake levels dropped, and the interest rates climbed, and people stopped buying $20,000 bass boats, and Kurt started wearing his smile a little too tight, like a belt on the last notch. I want to be fair to Kurt, even now, because being fair is the only thing they couldn't take from me. There was a night, before any of this, when I was up at 2 a.m. turning Earl the way the nurses taught me, and I heard Kurt out on our porch on the telephone, his voice low and ragged, saying, "I know what I owe. I know. Just give me till the end of the month." His ear had gone red, the way it does when he is scared. I almost went out and put a hand on his shoulder. I almost made him a cup of coffee. I have asked myself 100 times whether things would have gone differently if I had. I will never know. That is one of the prices you pay in a story like this, the not knowing. I should tell you about Earl, the way he was, or you won't understand what I was fighting for. Earl Holloway is a quiet man who shows love by fixing things. 47 years of marriage, and he never once said a flowery word. But every Friday of our life together, he fried catfish in the backyard in a cast-iron skillet. And he always gave me the first piece. And he always said it came out better than last time, even when it didn't. His hands were rough as bark from the refinery, and gentle as anything when he held a baby. That is the man. I need you to see him whole, the way I do, because the people in this story had stopped seeing him as anything but a sick body in a bed and a pile of money attached to it. The stroke came 14 months ago, on an ordinary Tuesday, while he was rinsing his coffee cup at the sink. One minute he was humming, and the next, the cup was in pieces on the floor, and he was looking at me with half his face gone still, and a question in his eyes I couldn't answer. The doctors saved his life. They could not give me back the man who could finish his own sentences. Earl is still in there. That matters, because the people in this story forgot it. He understands more than he can say. When I read to him in the evenings, the good eye follows the page. And he has a thing he does, an old thing from before, where he squeezes my hand twice. It means, I'm here. Remember that. It comes back. I became his caregiver overnight. At 65 years old, with 2 bad knees of my own, I learned to crush his pills into applesauce so he wouldn't choke. I learned to turn him every 2 hours through the night so he wouldn't get sores. The menthol rub sharp in my nose. The little brass bell on his blanket so he could call me if I dozed off in the chair. Some nights I'd wake in that chair with my neck crooked and not know what hour it was, only that the house was dark and a freight train was moaning somewhere out past the refinery. And I'd reach over and feel for his breathing before I let myself rest again. I did all of it because I loved him, and because 47 years ago, he drove 12 miles an hour through an ice storm so I wouldn't be scared. You do not keep score with a man like that. You just stay. If you have ever sat up in the dark with someone you love, listening to make sure they're still breathing, you already understand this story better than my daughter did. I'd be glad to know where you're listening from tonight, and whether you've ever been the one in the chair. But let me get back to it, because the first crack had already started, and I almost didn't see it for what it was. It began with Renata being helpful. That is how these things begin. She started coming by more, which I was grateful for. Lord knows I was lonesome. And she started asking questions. gentle ones at first. "Mama, do you even know what's in Daddy's accounts? Mama, who's keeping up with the bills? You've got so much on your plate." I answered her honestly, because she was my daughter, and it never crossed my mind not to. I told her about Earl's pension money from the refinery, sitting safe in a certificate of deposit. I told her about our savings. I told her the number. I have thought about that number every day since. There was a flicker, even then, that I should have read better. One afternoon, she was filling out a deposit slip for me at the kitchen table, doing me a kindness, and her hand was shaking so hard the pen skipped. I asked if she was all right. She said she was just tired, but she wouldn't look at me, and her ear had gone a little red, the same as her husband's. And I think now that some part of my girl already knew what road she was on and hated herself for being on it. People can do a wrong thing and grieve it at the same time. I have come to believe that is most of how wrong things get done. Then Kurt got involved, and the questions stopped being gentle. He sat at my kitchen table one evening, turning his cap around in his hands, and said, "Verna, can I be straight with you? You're doing too much. We worry about you. What if you have a fall? What if something happens to you? Who takes care of Earl then?" And then, easy as anything, like he was offering to mow the lawn, "What you need is to make Renata power of attorney. Just to streamline things, so if you're laid up, the bills still get paid." It sounded like love. That is the cruelest part, how much it sounded like love. Sitting there with my daughter nodding along, both of them looking at me with such concern, I felt something I am ashamed of. I felt grateful. For about 3 days, I thought my children were taking care of me. The second rung came at the doctor's office. They both insisted on driving me to my own checkup, which I thought was sweet until we got in the room. The whole appointment, Renata talked for me. "She's been so forgetful lately, doctor." She got turned around at the grocery store last week. None of it was true. I had not gotten turned around anywhere. But I sat there, 66 years old and worn down to the bone from no sleep. And when the doctor asked me a question, I was so rattled and so tired that I stumbled over my words. And I saw the doctor write something down. Later, I would learn what she wrote. Patient appeared tearful and overwhelmed. 4 words. They would try to build a whole prison out of 4 words. That was the night I stopped sleeping for real. I lay in the dark next to Earl's empty side of the bed, listening to the oxygen machine the man next door runs, and a cold thought walked up and sat on my chest. They are not protecting me. They are building a case. And the thing they want is the money that keeps Earl alive. I'll be honest with you about that night, because I promised myself I'd tell this true. For about an hour, lying there, I believed them. That is what frightens me to admit. They had said it so many times, so gently, that a little voice in me whispered, "Maybe you are slipping. Maybe you can't manage. Maybe they know best." That is the real danger of being told you're confused by people who smile while they say it. It gets inside. I had to lie there and walk back through my own mind, room by room, and check that the lights still worked. They did. Every one of them. And once I knew that for certain, the fear turned into something steadier. Not anger. Footing. The third rung. They didn't even bother to hide. The home health aide, a kind young woman named Pilar, who comes Tuesdays and Thursdays to help me with Earl, was right there in the room. Renata was frustrated because I'd asked one too many questions about that power of attorney paper. And she turned to me, in front of Pilar, in front of Earl in his bed, and she said it. "Mama, stop. Just stop. You can't handle this anymore, okay? You can barely handle Daddy. Let the grown-ups deal with the money." The grown-ups? I was changing that child's diapers before Kurt Pruitt was out of high school. Earl made a sound from the bed, a low, broken sound. His good hand was reaching toward me across the blanket, shaking. I went and took it, and he squeezed twice. "I'm here." And I squeezed back. And I made him a promise without saying a word out loud. "Whatever this is, you are not going where they want to put your money. Not while I'm breathing." Pilar didn't say anything in the moment, but before she left that day, she touched my arm at the door and said, quiet, "Mrs. Holloway, I see a lot of families. You watch yourself." It was the first kind thing anyone outside that house had said to me in a month, and it was enough to remind me I was not crazy, no matter how hard they were working to make me feel that way. They tried to close the world in around me, too, which is the part nobody warns you about. I found out later that Kurt had called the aid agency and told them I was getting hard to work with and not really coping, planting the idea before I could plant the truth. He mentioned to a neighbor or two that poor Werner was slipping. It is a quiet kind of cruelty, going around a person's back to arrange the story of them before they can tell it themselves. For a few days, I felt the loneliness of it like a draft under a door. Everyone suddenly gentle with me in that careful way you are gentle with someone you've decided is broken. But it backfired in one place. My neighbor, Frank, who is 78 and has ploughed my driveway every winter since Earl got sick, heard the talk and didn't believe a word of it. He came over with 2 cups of gas station coffee, sat himself down on my unoiled porch swing and said, "Werner, I've known you 40 years. You've got more sense than the whole rest of this street put together. Whatever's going on, you call me." I have learned that in the worst stretch of a thing, sometimes the whole rescue is one stubborn old man with 2 cups of coffee refusing to believe the lie. It put steel back in me. I was not alone, and I was not slipping. And now, I had a witness. There was one more thing they did, and it was the one that made up my mind for good. That week, Earl's old pickup, the green one he'd kept running for 20 years, disappeared from the driveway. Kurt had sold it. Didn't ask, didn't mention it, just sold it for cash because it was sitting there doing nothing. And a man drowning sees everything sitting still as something he can sell. Earl couldn't drive it anymore, that was true, but it was his. And watching that empty patch of driveway where his truck used to be, I understood that to them, everything in our life was already a thing sitting there doing nothing. Including me. Including Earl. Especially Earl's money. So here is what I did next. And I'll tell it plain, because the version of me they expected was an old woman who would either roll over or fall apart screaming. I did neither. I did the thing they never imagined, because they had stopped seeing me as a person who does things. I made an appointment. 3 of them, actually. The first was with my own doctor, alone this time. I drove my old Mercury down there myself, the one the colour of weak coffee. And I sat across from Dr. Ferris and I said, "I need you to do something for me. My daughter is telling people I'm losing my mind because she wants control of my husband's money. I need to know what you actually think. And if you think I'm of sound mind, I need it in writing, dated and signed." Dr. Ferris looked at me for a long moment. Then she had me do all the things they do. the questions and the clock drawing and the rest. And at the end, she took off her glasses and said, "Verna, there is nothing wrong with your mind. You're exhausted, and you're grieving, and you're carrying too much. But you are as sharp as you ever were." She wrote the letter. I folded it into my purse like it was the deed to the world. The second appointment was with a lawyer named Inez Marsh, who handles elder matters and does not suffer fools. I laid the whole thing out for her across her desk. She listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. And when I finished, she said 3 things that I have held on to ever since. She said, "A power of attorney signed by a person under pressure can be challenged, and challenged hard." She said that as long as I was a joint owner on those accounts and of sound mind, no piece of paper let anyone move that money over my objection. And then she leaned forward and said the thing that mattered most. "Verna, a power of attorney is not a magic key. It comes with a legal duty. The minute they use it for themselves instead of for your husband, they have broken the law. And a bank is very, very good at noticing when that happens." I almost laughed out loud, sitting in that office, because the third appointment I had already made in my head, and now I knew exactly what it was for. The third appointment was with my bank. Not to make a scene, just to walk in, plain as a Tuesday, and put them on notice that I did not consent to $1 moving without me. The rest, I trusted the place to handle. I had spent 38 years being the place that handled it. I want to be honest about the morning I was finally set to walk into my bank, because I came close to not going. I sat in the Mercury in the driveway with the doctor's letter in my purse and my hands at 10 and 2, and I did not turn the key for a long while. A voice in me said, "What if you make this worse? What if they're right that you're too much trouble? What if a daughter's tears beat an old woman's word every time?" I sat there until the windshield fogged. .com. And then I thought of Earl reaching his shaking hand across the blanket, and Frank with his 2 cups of coffee, and a 19-year-old boy in a too big suit I'd taught to count a drawer. And I turned the key. Courage, at my age, is not a roar. It is just turning the key when everything in you wants to go back inside. 2 days before I could get downtown, Kurt got impatient. A man drowning does not wait politely for the tide. He took that fresh power of attorney with my daughter's name on it, and he drove to a branch of First Cattleman's across town, the new one out by the highway where they don't know me, and he tried to start moving Earl's pension. He was smart about it, or thought he was. He didn't ask for the whole certificate of deposit at once. He asked to break it and move it in pieces, a little here, a little there. The kind of thing a man does when he doesn't want anybody to look too close. Money headed, dollar by dollar, toward a boat dealership bleeding out by a shrinking lake. And it almost worked. A brand new teller out there, a young woman named Brittany who couldn't have been 22, looked at the notarized power of attorney, looked sympathetic at the sad story Renata told over the telephone about her poor sick father and her poor confused mother. And she very nearly let the first piece go through. I know exactly how close it was, because that young woman told me herself, later, with her face gone red. She had her hand on the keys. She told me she even felt something was off, a little wrong note in how fast they wanted it done. But she was new, and she was scared of being difficult. And the paper looked right. The paper always looks right. That is the whole trick. She was 3 keystrokes from sending Earl's care down the highway to a bankrupt boat lot. That is the moment, If this were one of those television movies where the music would tell you the old woman has already lost. The papers were signed. The doctor's note said, tearful and overwhelmed, my daughter had a good cry ready for anyone who'd listen. I was at home crushing pills into applesauce, and I did not even know it was happening. What Kurt did not know, what Renata never thought to ask, was who runs security and fraud now for all of First Cattleman's, every branch in 3 counties. His name is Hollis Tran. In the summer of 1991, Hollis came to my window as a nervous 19-year-old in his father's too-big suit, hired as a teller for the season, certain he was going to fail. He counted his draw 4 times a day because he was so afraid of being short. And I stood next to that boy for a whole summer, and I taught him everything. How to feel a bad bill, how to read a hand, how to slow down and look at the thing in front of you instead of the story somebody is telling you about it. Hollis stayed 33 years. He worked his way up from my window to the back office, to running fraud for the whole region. And every Christmas, without fail, he sends me a card that says the same thing. Thank you for teaching me to look twice. When Kurt's little stream of broken-up withdrawals started moving across the system, it tripped exactly the kind of flag Hollis spends his days hunting. Sudden activity. An account belonging to an elderly couple. Money being structured into small pieces, headed toward a business that was not theirs. It landed on Hollis Tran's desk on a Thursday afternoon, and the name on the account was Earl and Verna Holloway. He told me he sat there and looked at my name for a full minute. Then he put a hold on every dollar, picked up the telephone, and called the house. I was in the chair by Earl's bed when it rang. Mrs. Holloway, Hollis said, and I could hear that 19-year-old still in there somewhere. I need you to come down here, and I think you'd best bring whatever proof you've got that you're exactly who you've always been. I brought the doctor's letter. I brought Inez Marsh, and I brought 38 years. I will not pretend the meeting was a shouting match, because it wasn't. And the not shouting was the whole point. They were already there when I walked in, Renata and Kurt, sitting in the glass-walled office with the bank's lawyer and a look on their faces like children who'd heard a car in the driveway too early. Renata started in the second she saw me. Mama, what are you doing here? You shouldn't have driven. You're not... Renata, I said, just her name, and something in my voice, the bank voice, the one I used for 38 years on men who lied at my window, made her stop cold. Hollis laid it out for the room without any drama, which is the right way to lay out something that has all the drama it needs on its own. The power of attorney did not permit what had been attempted. Money belonging to Earl and to me had been broken into pieces and routed toward Kurt Pruitt's dealership. A business with, it turned out, its own troubles, its own tangled books, its own questions the bank was now obligated to ask out loud and in writing. Under the law, he explained, what Kurt had done was not bill paying. It was elder financial exploitation, and the bank was required to report it to the state's protective services and let the matter go where such matters go. Kurt's ear went red, the same red as that night on my porch. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. And then Renata played her last card, the one she'd been keeping. She turned to the bank's lawyer, tears coming up right on time, and she said it again, the sentence she'd practiced, the one that started this whole thing. You have to understand, my mother can't handle money anymore. She's confused. I have a doctor's note. And she had it too, that scrap with the 4 words. That was the moment. The room went quiet, and for one breath, Even I wondered if 4 words on a doctor's intake form could outweigh everything else in the world. Hollis stood up. He buttoned his jacket, the way I taught him to before you say something that matters, and he said, "Renata, I've known your mother since I was 19 years old. She is the one who taught me how to catch a person doing exactly what your husband just tried to do." He turned to the bank's lawyer. "This woman trained half the tellers in this county, including me. There is nothing wrong with her judgment. The only judgment I'd question is whoever decided she wouldn't notice." Then Inez Marsh slid the doctor's letter across the table, dated 4 days earlier, signed, plain as day, of sound mind, sharp as she ever was. I watched it land on my daughter's face. Not the bank's case collapsing. She didn't care about that. What landed was that I had seen it coming. That the mother she'd decided was too dim to count had been 3 steps ahead the whole time. Quietly, without ever once raising her voice. She looked at me like she had never seen me before. Maybe she hadn't. Maybe nobody had bothered to in a long while. I drove home from that bank the long way, past the refinery and the wheat just starting to go gold. And the quiet in the car was the first easy quiet I'd had in 6 weeks. When I got in, I sat down on the edge of Earl's bed and I told him all of it. Slow, the way I tell him everything now, watching the good eye to know he was with me. I told him about Hollis buttoning his jacket. I told him his money was safe, that nobody was sending it down the highway, that he was going nowhere. And Earl, who cannot say my name anymore, lifted that good hand and found mine and squeezed it twice. I'm here. I put my forehead down on his chest and stayed there a while, listening to his heart, the bravest sound I know. The reckoning, when it came, did not feel the way I thought it would. There was no triumph in it. The power of attorney was revoked that week through Inez. The bank's report went where such reports go, and Kurt's dealership and its tangled books became a matter for people with more authority than me. He lost the business by the fall, not because of anything I did to him, but because a man who builds his life on money that isn't his runs out of road eventually. The lake never came back up either. Some things just don't. Renata called me 40 times the week it all came down. I didn't answer at first. I needed the quiet. But here is what I did instead, because this is the part that matters more to me than any of the rest. I went to see Inez Marsh one more time, and I had her set up something proper, a trust with Earl's money locked inside it, where it can only ever be spent on one thing: Earl's care. Not mine, not Renata's, not a boat dealership's. His. The good doctors, the good aid, the medicine. The bed turned every 2 hours for as long as he has. I made it so that no piece of paper signed by anyone under any sad story can ever move that money away from the man it belongs to. The thing they wanted to steal, I made untouchable. That was my answer. Not revenge. A wall around the one I love, built brick by legal brick, by a woman they swore couldn't handle money. I did finally answer the telephone. Renata came to the house and sat in my kitchen and cried. Real crying this time, not the kind she'd practiced. She said Kurt had told her it was the only way, that they'd pay it back, that she'd convinced herself it was for Daddy. I let her talk, and when she was done, I said the only true thing I had. I know you started out trying to help, and I know where it went. You don't get to manage my money, Renata. Not ever again. But you are still my daughter, And that door is not locked. Come see your father. He misses you. He understands more than you think. She looked toward the dining room, toward the bed. And for the first time in a long time, she looked 9 years old again, holding a peanut butter jar full of dimes. It is not a clean ending. Real ones rarely are. But it is an honest one. And she comes on Sundays now, and she sits with him. And that is more than I had a month ago. Earl is still here. The flare burns out at the refinery on the horizon at night, the way it has our whole lives, and I read to him in the evenings, and the good eye follows the page. The little glass bird Renata gave me when she was 9 is still on the kitchen sill, and every night before I turn off the lamp, I take his hand, and he squeezes it twice. I'm here, and I squeeze back. So am I. Nobody is moving us. Nobody is moving our money. That promise I made without words, the one I made over his shaking hand the day my daughter called me too old to count. I kept it. So here is the one thing I'll leave you with, and then I'll let you go. They thought being old and worn down to the bone meant I'd lost the thing that mattered. But the work of a whole life does not leave you just because your knees do. I spent 38 years learning to look twice at the story somebody hands me across a counter. They forgot that. Don't you ever let anyone smile at you and tell you you've been handling your own life too long to handle it now. The counting you've done all these years, all of it, it is still in your hands. It was always in your hands. If you've made it all the way to the end of this with me, then you're the kind of person who stays in the chair. And I'm glad of your company tonight. Tell me where you're listening from. And tell me this, would you have answered the telephone on the 40th ring? I think you already know what I did. If this story meant something to you, stay a while and hear another. I'll keep the lamp on.